right, we're in part 2 of a series on teaching like Jesus, and the big idea is it is not enough to teach what Jesus taught, to teach the content of the gospel, but we want to teach how Jesus taught. It is possible to bore people with the gospel, and we don't want to be those kind of teachers. So anyway, hope you had a good week this week, looking at the life of Jesus yourself and finding what principles you could find. You might pause the tape and I want to say tape. I started doing this back in the days it was tape. But anyway, pause the recording for a moment and talk about what did you discover from your reading this week about how Jesus taught. Here are the 4 things we're going to look at in this series. Stories, proverbs, questions, reward. Jesus taught using stories. He asked lots of questions. He taught using proverbs, and he taught with an appeal to reward. We'll be talking about all 4 of those. But this week, we'll be talking about stories. So let's look at a few Bible verses that speak to this. The first one, Mark 4:2. He taught them using stories, many stories. Now you notice I've used a paraphrase, and it uses the word stories. If you're using a more straightforward translation, you might observe that it uses the word parable, and you might think that this is a bad translation to use the word stories. Well, actually, in fact, stories is a very good translation. In fact, parable is not a translation at all. It is what we call a transliteration. A translation is when we take a Greek word and we convert it to an English word. I'll bet you can translate this word, for example. There's a Greek word, agape, and it translates into the English word, love, right? All right. So that's what we mean by translating. We take a Greek word and we give it the meaning of an English word. But then there is a concept called transliteration. And this is where we take not a Greek word, but a Greek letter. We take the Greek letter for B, for example, and we translate it into the English letter, beta, and we translate the English letter for B, and we take a Greek letter alpha, and we translate it into the English letter A, and we go B-A-P-T, and da-da-da, and we get the word baptize. And the Greek word is baptizo, and the English word is baptize. And we haven't translated the word, we transliterated the word. The reason they did that, by the way, is because back in the day, the practice of the church, the person who was paying for the translation that was being done, the practice of the church was they would sprinkle, as a lot of churches do still today. And the translators who were dealing with this knew that this was not, it's true, a lot of words in the Bible, by the way, good question you could ask when you teach us, what did this word mean before it was a Bible word? Because this was not really a Bible word. It was not a theological word. There's a place in Mark where it speaks about they are washing dishes, and they use this word baptized. They baptize the dishes. See, it's not a spiritual, religious thing that they did the dishes. They just wash the dishes. And when you wash the dishes, do you sprinkle them or do you put them underneath the water? Well, we put them underneath the water. Well, the translators knew that's what the word meant. The word means to immerse. They knew if they translated this and then he immersed them, which would be a good translation for that word, they knew they'd get themselves in trouble. So they came up with an English word that they just transliterated. They took the Greek word, baptizo, and transliterated into an English word. We have a similar dynamic with the word parable. All right? So it is not translated so much as it is transliterated. Now, based on that, if you're following along, what do you think the Greek word for parable is? Parabole, actually, is how it be pronounced, something along those lines. But more or less, parable. And it means that something is thrown alongside. You might pick up the meaning of being parallel, or it comes from that same Greek word. So we have a story, and then there's a meaning that is thrown alongside what it meant. And so that's where the word comes from. But it really just means a story. And if you were actually translating it, as a number of translations do have it, it simply means story. So anyway, Mark 4:2, he taught them using stories, many stories. With many stories like these, he presented the message to them, fitting the stories to their experience and maturity. Matthew 22:1, Jesus responded by telling them still more stories. And you don't get it, so I'll tell you some more and some more and some more and even more stories. Matthew 13:34, I love this verse. All Jesus did that day was tell stories, a long storytelling afternoon. Wouldn't you love to have been there that afternoon and just listen to Jesus tell story after story after story after story? And I sometimes hear teachers say, well, I don't want to be some storytelling teacher. I'm just going to teach the word. Teach like Jesus, brother. And Jesus taught using stories. In fact, a more straightforward translation of this verse, the CEV says, Jesus used stories when he spoke to the people. In fact, he did not tell them anything without using stories. And I wonder about you. Do you ever use stories? Ever teach without using stories? If so, let me encourage you, teach like Jesus. Basically, you could summarize teaching like Jesus this way. Come up with the big idea. I think there's something to be said, big follower of Andy Stanley, and he has a phrase that he calls teaching less for more. And the big idea is to try to concentrate, try to focus the lesson into one main concept. And so that's what you want to try to figure out is, what am I going to try to teach the people today? As some old teacher preachers says the preacher ought to be able to summarize his message, and people ought to be able to hear it by saying, the preacher said thus. And when I've preached over the years, sometimes I'd ask even one of my kids, the kids are 6 or 8 years old, and you'd ask them, what did Daddy preach about? Today you preached about generosity. Well, there we go. Okay, we're on the right page, I suppose. But in fact, we want to summarize and then ask yourself, what are some stories that illustrate this truth? In fact, he did not tell them anything without using stories. Now, as I was preparing this talk for the first time, I was delivering a message that weekend on materialism. And I thought, let's try to apply this principle that I am teaching. So we have the biblical verses, and we would unpack those just a little bit, exegete those just a bit. And then we want to tell some stories. And I found a couple of stories about a BMW. And first story goes like this. This guy has a BMW, and he's proud of that BMW, and he likes to drive fast in that BMW. And he's out on one mountainous road one time, and it gets to going a little too fast, and he goes off the edge and down the ravine and falls out of the car, and the car goes down and explodes into an explosion of flame. And he and his friend who are in the car both tossed out, so they're on the mountainside there, and he's looking down at his BMW, and he says, "Oh, my BMW, my BMW, my BMW. It's so sad, my BMW." And his friend looks up at him and says, "Hey, buddy, you got a bigger problem than your BMW. Look up the mountain there. Your arm fell off in the crash. It got cut off in the crash. You don't have an arm." He looked up there and he said, "Oh, my Rolex, my Rolex, my Rolex." Now, we have brain science to prove that when you get done, if you're at a meeting at a church or someplace, at home or wherever tonight, and you get home and somebody asks you, like maybe you're a husband, a man, and your wife asks you when you get home, what did you learn about teaching like Jesus tonight? There's a good chance that story will come to mind. Your brain is wired for stories. To take the title of a book, your brain is wired for stories. So, first story is my Rolex, my Rolex. Second story, also about a BMW guy, and actually a gal selling a BMW, and I'm told this is a true story. I don't know that for fact, but anyway, I'm told this is a true story. A woman put an ad in the LA Times that said BMW for sale, brand new, late model, last year's model, whatever, low mileage, less than 10,000 miles, let's say, and selling it for $50. Well, he thought, somebody must have missed a few zeros, but he went over to check it out, and sure enough, man, it's a shiny new BMW, and it looks beautiful, and so on. And so he took it out for test drive, and it drives great, and looks great, and everything's great, and checked out great. So he hands her $50. She hands him the keys and signs over the title and so on. And then he pauses and he says, "Man, I got to ask, why are you selling this nearly brand new, pristine BMW for $50? She said, "Well, it's not really any of your business, but my husband is having an affair. And he called me from Las Vegas, where he is spending the week with his girlfriend. And he told me to sell the BMW and send him whatever I made." And once again, somebody asks you what you learned tonight, you're going to remember that story. Your brain is wired for story, and Jesus knew that, and he used stories constantly when he taught. So let's talk for a bit about what kind of stories or how to find stories. First source of stories is your own life. This may sound a little bit selfish to you, but I think you ought to tell, and not too many. It's a tricky balance. I would say, if you had to push me for an answer, I don't be hardcore on this, but maybe around 20% of your stories out of your own life. The point is, it ought to be a minority, but a significant minority. There's an old saying again about preaching, that preaching is truth that has been poured through the preacher, and it ought to have a bit of your smell on it. People want to know, how does this work in your life? How did you forgive when it was hard to forgive, when you wanted to punch them, how did you forgive? Tell me a story about how that worked in your life. Tell me a story about how you serve. Tell me a story about how you have learned to rejoice in the Lord always. Tell some stories out of your own life. Not too many. This is not the you hour. It's not about you. But it ought to have some feeling of not just principles and vague ideas and this background and this Greek word and so on and so on. It ought to have some sense of this is how it is applied to my life. Then we want to tell some stories from the Bible. Particularly if you're teaching a New Testament concept, you want to look for Old Testament stories. So you might ask directly, what is an Old Testament story? For example, here's a great question for you. Let's say you're teaching on Romans 8:28. This is kind of an easy one, actually. But Romans 8:28, what is an Old Testament story that illustrates Romans 8:28? If you can, say it out loud. Turn to the person next to you. The story of Joseph was the one I was that was coming to my mind, and it's just a great Romans 8:28 story. And you're teaching that principle. You go to that story. You end up doing what my daddy used to say. My daddy's a preacher, and he'd say, it does double duty," meaning that it teaches the truth of the gospel, but it also teaches the Bible. And there's more to Christian teaching than getting people to be smarter sinners. But there's certainly not less than that. What I mean is, I want people over time to know. I had a guy say to me one time, now Joseph, he had that coat of many colors, right? Yeah. And that was the stepfather, I guess, of Jesus. Stepfather of Jesus was Joseph, but that's a different Joseph. And if people sit in my teaching over time, I'd like for them to get that straight. I'd like for them to know. I've got a whole series, by the way, I did on the Old Testament survey where I make the point. I want them to know who came first, David or Daniel. I want them to hold the whole flow of the story. So the idea is when you're teaching a New Testament principle, tell an Old Testament story to illustrate that. Then I want to encourage you to read some what I call story-rich books. And it's taught this so many times. I wish I had a live audience here to work with. But anyway, who can you think of that is an example of a story-rich author? That is an author that uses lots of stories. Max Lucado comes to mind. John Ortberg is one of my favorite authors. Definitely have a lot of stories. Chuck Swindoll, Charles Swindoll, pretty much any great author. David Jeremiah, on and on and on. And so you might look at story-rich books. You might look on sermoncentral.com. I love this webpage because you can look for a story. Once again, you study the passage, come up with a big idea, then ask what are some stories to illustrate this. And you can go to Sermon Central and you can look up John 3:16 if you're teaching on John 3:16 and get a bunch of stories. Or you can take a topic, forgiveness or servanthood or second coming or whatever the topic might be, and you can look for topic. And then you can look for type of stories. I heard a teacher say recently, it is the rare communicator who can communicate effectively without some humor. And I find a humorous story in the middle of a talk always kind of helps. You notice I told you a couple of humorous stories and probably kind of perked up your attention just a little bit. We're not there to be stand-up comics, but a little bit of humor goes a long way. And you find some of the most effective communicators often use humor. And if you're not naturally funny, particularly, you might just look up. All right, I want a passage on forgiveness, but I want one that's funny. You go to sermoncentral.com and it can sort that out for you. And then at the risk of being flagrantly self-promoting, let me mention my own resource. I would argue I'm the world's number one Bible study lesson writer, and that is my resource, Good Questions Have Groups Talking. And they consist of about 20 questions each, and then answers that are quoted from other well-known writers. And the gist is, if Max Lucado ever mentioned this Sunday's passage, I will probably find it, and I will provide it to the teachers that I serve. And the lessons go along with 3 of Lifeway's outlines, as well as the International Standard Series. And in addition to that, there's hundreds, probably 1,000 plus lessons that you can sign up as an individual or as a church. About $10 per teacher per year. If you sign up as an individual, and I will try to provide you as many stories as I can. If you're using Lifeway's outlines, it works great. You just use those supplementary, or you might take a look at doing them yourselves. But as you teach this weekend, let me encourage you to think about what is the big idea that you're going to teach on. And as you discuss in your group here in just a moment, you might talk about what is the lesson. And just let me encourage you also, you ought to know what the lesson is by now. We don't want any Saturday night specials, as the saying goes. That is, we want lessons. We want to teach lessons that percolate in your life over time. So we're going to start in early, and I hope by now you know the kind of the big idea of what you're going to be teaching on Sunday. And you might brainstorm together. What are some stories that I could use to teach? And then you might ask some questions like, why are stories so effective? And why do we tend to hesitate to use stories? So discuss the idea of teaching using stories, and then we'll see you next week.